In this video, we're going to discuss using third-party software with TerreSculptor 3. Specifically, what we're going to be discussing is using software such as Photoshop or World Creator or QGIS or any other third-party software and saving or exporting files out of that and then importing those into TerreSculptor. One thing to keep in mind is most other software only supports file formats such as PNG and TIFF. And PNG and TIFF do not contain scale and elevation information in them like a digital elevation model file does. There's no GIS data in a PNG file. So you end up having to know what you want for elevation information ahead of time to enter into TerreSculptor to be able to get the scale correct. So for example, if you're exporting out of Photoshop, Photoshop will use a 16-bit PNG for full scale of 0 to 65,535 without actually having any elevation data. All it knows is the grayscale values. And depending on the software that you're using, all that you may have is just the straight raw elevation data without any height or elevation range information in it. Only digital elevation models contain GIS information for height data. So hopefully the software that you're using contains settings for what you want for the elevation range to bring it into TerreSculptor. One thing to keep in mind is when you import into TerreSculptor, it always full scales the file that you're actually importing. So for example, if we import a PNG file, that PNG file will be normalized when it's imported into TerreSculptor. So for example, in Photoshop, if it was using the values between 0 and 32,000, TerreSculptor will normalize that to 0 to 65,535. You would then use the terrain properties for scale to be able to get that elevation range back out of it, or use the altitude modifier and modify it back. So for example, here I'm going to import a PNG file. This is a 16-bit grayscale, which is the highest quality you can get in a PNG file. Now, if we look at the GIS panel, you can see there's no elevation information or scale information contained within the PNG file. So we have no way to know what the original size and elevation range for this specific file was. And that's going to be the same thing when you're exporting out of most software other than GIS software. Most other software does not contain scale information. Now, for example, I'm going to import a bill file, which is a digital elevation model. Common digital elevation model file formats are bill, height, float, geotiff, etc. I'm going to open a bill file. Now, this bill file, it actually has a header that contains information, parameters about the data of the file. It contains a projection file, which contains things like latitude and longitude. And this one contains a world file that contains scaling information and such as well. So if I import this, we can see here now on the GIS panel, it's actually filled out. It's actually read and parsed and filled out all of the GIS data for this specific height map. So I can now go into terrain properties, geoscale, set spacing XYZ to GIS values, and it will scale the height map to the real world dimensions and elevation of what this real digital elevation model was. So this is the actual real scale as it appears on the Earth. Digital elevation model files can be sourced for the Earth, Mars, Moon, other locations, and the digital elevation models will contain the real world scale information on it. But when you're dealing with most other software does not have the real world scale. So you have to know what the original real world scale information is for the file, and you would then modify those properties. And in TerreSculptor, when you import the file, for example, if I import a PNG, I can modify the terrain width, length, and height by changing these spacing values or the spacing parameters. And that actually changes what I end up having for terrain properties within the property panel here. So that's how you would rescale something to be real world scale again. So for example, if I go back into this one and reset it back to the real world values again and refresh this, we can now see what the actual elevation range and what the actual width and length of the height map actually is, or of the digital elevation model. And if I import a GeoTIFF file as well, go to Geoscale, set spacing to XYZ. That scales this one to real world size, and if I refresh the properties, we can now see what the width, length, and height of the digital elevation model is. If I look at the GIS properties, we can see all the GIS properties. So when you're dealing with other third-party software, you usually don't have the digital elevation model GIS data, so you end up having to go in and modify things like the XYZ spacing and refresh and check the terrain width, length, and height to see exactly if you've actually got it to the correct value. Now, it's fairly easy to calculate that stuff out in TerreSculptor. You'll notice that the full scale range for TerreSculptor is from 0 to 100. So you can think of that as a percent. Now the Y scale property right here of 512 means that to go full scale from 0 to 100 gives 512 meters worth of elevation range. As you can see here, we've got 512 meters. If I change the Y spacing to 200 and refresh this, you can now see we've got 1.024 kilometers. Now, Unreal Engine 5 works the same way. Unreal Engine 5 uses the same scale property in it for how it scales on the elevation axis. So, for example, in Unreal Engine 5, a Z scale value of 100 gives you a total elevation range of 512 meters. A Z scale of 200 gives you a total elevation range of 1.024 kilometers. So when you're scaling this stuff out to be able to export it to Unreal Engine or to be able to create TIN files or export to OBJ meshes, you first calculate out what your X, Y, and Z spacing values are to get the real world terrain size. And then once you've got that, you can use these exact same values in Unreal Engine, for example. The X, Y, and Z spacing values here are the same values that you use for the X, Z, and Y scale in Unreal Engine. Notice that Y and Z are flipped. It's Y in TerreSculptor and Z in Unreal Engine. And also when you go to create TIN tiles and use the scale mesh by terrain properties for creating TIN tiles or to export OBJ meshes, and you want to scale by the terrain properties, it uses these exact values that you've entered in here to scale the mesh data for the TIN or for the OBJ file for the mesh. So just keep in mind, the basic bottom line of it is file formats like PNG and TIFF do not contain scale information. So you have to get that scale information from the source program that you're working with. Or if you don't know what it is in there, you can modify the X, Y, and Z spacing values here once you've imported it and keep hitting the refresh button and it'll show you the width, length, and height in real world sizing here in TerreSculptor. And then these spacing values are used in the TIN creator, and also these spacing values are used for the same scale values in Unreal Engine 5. Anyway, I hope that made sense. That's it for this video.